Welcome back to the Past Precedent, where I'm in the middle of my first project, the 53 most important historical events in Western civilization, where I'm picking the most important event of each century, starting in the 32nd century BCE and working my way through each century up until our present 21st century CE. This project is perfect for you if you're looking to build a strong foundation for historical discussion, because this project provides the necessary structure, context, and sources needed for these discussions. However, if you're only interested in this video, it's perfect for you if you want to learn about the founding of Babylon, its influence, and the sources supporting it. Now, so far in this project, I've already covered 12 important events over the previous 12 centuries, so go check out those videos if you want. But in this video, I'll be covering 3 events in 3 centuries, the 20th, the 19th, and 18th centuries BCE, and all of them are connected to the ancient great city of Babylon. So without further delay, let's get started. We start in the 20th century BCE, and this century belongs to the Amorite migration. The Amorites are one of several groups who took advantage of the political instability of Mesopotamia after the fall of the 3rd dynasty of Ur. But they stand out more than the rest because in the end, it was a faction of this group that came out on top to rule the region. What happened was after the fall of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, due to weak leaders and a famine that affected the economy of the entire Fertile Crescent, city-states began fighting each other again. And while all this was happening, the Amorites in large masses started to immigrate into this area from the west. And they became entangled in the battles to control these city-states against competing Akkadians, Elamites, Assyrians, and other groups. And as the 20th century BCE ran its course, different groups of Amorites began to rule different city-states like Larsa, Isin, and Uruk. And a quick side note, the word Amorite, which can be found in the Bible, derives from the Akkadian word Amaru, which means west, and the Sumerian equivalent of that is Martu, both of which can be found in documents outside the Bible written on cuneiform tablets. So the Amorites, from the point of view of their contemporary Mesopotamians, were simply seen as Westerners. And they were not viewed in a positive light either. Rather, they were viewed as a vile, uncivilized barbarians, similar to how the Romans viewed Germanic tribes outside the Roman Empire. Now, if we just isolate this century, the 20th century BCE, this immigration in itself isn't that significant, because the whole century was a turbulent time of competing factions. But as we'll see, the Amorites and their migration get the crown for this century because they will eventually have the most significant impact. As we enter the next century, the 19th century BCE, one of these Amorite groups found a city called Babylon. And historians call this group the First Dynasty of Babylon, and their rule lasted from 1894 to 1595 BCE. The First Dynasty ended when Babylon was sacked by the Hittites, who immediately left after the sack. Then another group, the Kassites, took over as rulers of Babylon, and the city would continue to endure for over 1,000 more years. But we'll talk more about that in a later video. Now, historians seem to debate who actually founded Babylon. Was it Samu Abum or Samu La'el? Information is sparse, so it's hard to tell. Either way, if we use the middle chronology to date their reigns, both of them ruled in the 19th century BCE, giving us the founding of Babylon to be the most important event of this century. Now, Babylonian fame doesn't really begin until the reign of the dynasty's 6th king, Hammurabi. He is remembered as a strong leader who conquered territory that stretched from the Persian Gulf to almost the Mediterranean. He built canals and temples, reinforced city walls, strengthened the army, maintained an effective bureaucracy, preserved Sumerian writing, and promoted his scribes to generate their own version of Akkadian writing, which scholars call Babylonian. But most of all, he is famous for his law code, known as the Code of Hammurabi. Now, this is not the first law code ever written. Fragments of earlier law codes have been found during the time of the 3rd dynasty of Ur. But since Hammurabi's code is the first law code to remain intact, it is the most famous. And if you're ever in Paris, you can see it at the Louvre, or more easily, of course, you can read it online if you have a spare hour. The code consists of 282 laws, both civil and criminal. And as stated in the prologue on the famous stone stele, the law is not just from the monarch, but the monarch gets the laws from the gods. More specifically, it states, "Then Anu and Bel called by name me, Hammurabi, the exalted prince, who feared God to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evildoers, so that the strong should not harm the weak, so that I should rule over the black-headed people like Shamish and enlighten the land to further the well-being of mankind." And you can see the god Shamash, who is the god of both sun and justice, is standing with Hammurabi at the top of the stone stele. In the code, most of the consequences for violating the laws are either a fine or death, but the most famous principle used in this law code was lex talionis, or the law of like punishment, a principle people most know today from the Bible, in phrases like eye for an eye or tooth for a tooth, as seen in Leviticus 24:20. And these phrases are also found verbatim in the Code of Hammurabi, which predates the Bible. Now, the Code of Hammurabi of the 18th century BCE was written long before the laws of Moses from the Old Testament, which wouldn't be written down for another 500 to 1,000 years. And actually, the first historical reference to Israel in a non-biblical text is from the stele of the pharaoh Merneptah, dated to around 1200 BCE. Then after this, the kings of Israel show up more and more in Aramaic and other cuneiform texts dated to around the 10th century BCE. And from that point, the Old Testament was slowly cobbled together and eventually arranged in the familiar form we know today, sometime in the second half of the first millennium BCE. So scholars do make connections between the Code of Hammurabi and the Old Testament, but not in the sense that one directly derives from the other, rather in the sense that the cultures described and the literary style used in the Old Testament evolved from the Semitic cultures of ancient Mesopotamia, like Babylon. Another example would be that King Hammurabi was one of many regional kings who liked to call himself the true shepherd of the people, a phrase that today's English-speaking world knows very well from this guy. Not only was this phrase known during the reign of Hammurabi, but is actually associated with one of the first ever epic kings in recorded history, the Sumerian king Gilgamesh. So a king or leader being the shepherd of his people is an idea that's definitely older than the Bible, and is possibly as old as writing itself, or even older than that. Now, I don't want to talk about the Bible too much here, but there is one more biblical connection important to the content of this video. When scholars try to place biblical events in a historical chronology, they seem to place Abraham in this area sometime between the Gutian invasion of the 22nd century BCE and the Amorite migration of the 20th century BCE. Now, Abraham, who is seen by many to be the father of the three great monotheistic religions, is from southern Mesopotamia in the city of Ur. And this city is where he begins his journey. Then he travels through the Fertile Crescent to Canaan, but not before stopping by Egypt because of that famine I mentioned earlier. And I won't be diving further into his story here. Rather, I'm just highlighting that biblical scholars seem to place Abraham in this culture around this time. And whether scholars believe that his story is true or not, most scholars believe that the history of Abraham was not written down at this time. Rather, it was written in the first half of the first millennium BCE. They know this because of the anachronisms found in the biblical text, such as references to the Earl of Chaldees and camels. The camel was not domesticated until the second half of the second millennium BCE, and the Chaldees did not rule Babylon until the first millennium BCE. But despite these anachronisms, most scholars don't have a problem saying that Abraham, or someone who inspired the story of Abraham, possibly came from this area around this time of the Amorite migration. They're simply looking at Abraham through the same historical lens as they would Gilgamesh, or Theseus, or Romulus, or even King Arthur. Meaning that they're not sure if any of these people actually existed, but if they did, then it's feasible that they could have come from those areas around those times. Now, the point of all that was not for me to start talking about the Bible. Rather, it was to drive home the point that Hammurabi's code and the Babylonian culture from which this code emerged is both the culture that preserved the Akkadian and Sumerian cultures that came before it, as well as influenced Mesopotamian cultures for the next 1500 years, including aspects of the Bible. So if there's one big takeaway from this video, is that the Babylonians took the torch of civilization from the Sumerians and the Akkadians and passed it along, and it still influences us today. Now, at this point, some of you might be wondering about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, or the Ishtar Gate, or the Tower of Babel, or the Babylonian captivity, but those are things associated with the Neo-Babylonians of the first millennium BCE. Here in this video, I've only been discussing the Old Babylonians. You see, Old Babylon was an influential power of the first half of the second millennium BCE. Then they declined and took a backseat to other regional powers, and Babylon was ruled by different groups. Then the Neo-Babylonians rose to power in the first millennium BCE, and they will be just as influential as the Old Babylonians, but in their own way. But that's a different video, and we'll discuss that in the future. So these three centuries, the 20th, 19th, and 18th centuries BCE, are all about the Amorites and how they founded Babylon, and how they created the most famous law code in antiquity. These people were important because they were able to carry the torch of civilization through a tumultuous time of collapse and famine, and ultimately preserve the culture they inherited, put their own cultural stamp on it, and pass it to future generations. Now, I know I just scratched the surface here, but I'm starting to make shorter, condensed videos to speed up this foundational project so we can move on to more in-depth projects. But if you want to dive deeper into Babylon right now, I recommend these books to get you started. I did use more books for this video, but you can look for those titles in the description of this video. And of course, if you think there are other events more important than these 3 events and these 3 centuries, please let me know in the comments and we'll discuss. In my next video, we're back in Egypt, and there we'll cover 2 centuries of Egyptian history. See you then.